What if I told you that the most powerful currency in human history isn't collapsing loudly, but quietly bleeding out behind closed doors? What if the U.S. dollar didn't begin losing power because of inflation or war or even bad politicians, but because its real foundation was outsourced, duplicated, and abused decades ago? Because if that's true, then everything you think you know about money is incomplete. Welcome to the Finance Historian. This channel exists for one reason: to uncover the parts of financial history that never make it into textbooks or evening news panels. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. This channel is a global classroom, and history doesn't belong to one country. And if you're tired of safe explanations and sanitized narratives, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear is the unfiltered truth. You can feel it already. Prices rising faster than your income. Savings shrinking in real terms. Jobs feeling less stable. Governments borrowing like tomorrow doesn't exist. And yet, they keep telling you, the dollar is strong. Strong compared to what? History gives us a warning, and it never changes. Every dominant currency collapses the same way. Not with panic, but with denial. Let's go back to the last empire that believed its currency would last forever. Britain. For more than a century, the British pound sterling ruled the world. Global trade flowed through London. Shipping insurance, banking settlements, international debt. If you controlled the pound, you controlled the system. Sound familiar? By the late 1800s, Britain controlled nearly 1/4 of global trade, the most powerful navy ever assembled, and the deepest financial markets on Earth. But here's what history teaches us. Power doesn't disappear first. Credibility does. Britain financed its empire with debt. Wars were paid for with promises. Gold quietly left the vaults. Then World War I arrived. In 1914, Britain suspended the gold standard. Money printing replaced discipline. And the public was told, this is temporary. That phrase matters, because every monetary collapse begins with the promise of later. After the war, Britain tried to restore the pound's value. In 1925, they forced it back to gold. It crushed workers. Exports collapsed. Capital fled. By World War II, the truth was unavoidable. Britain was broke. And in 1944, at a quiet meeting in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the torch was passed. The pound stepped down. The dollar stepped up. Say this with me. The system survived, but the foundation changed. Under Bretton Woods, the dollar became the anchor, fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency pegged to it. It looked permanent. But permanence is an illusion. America made the same mistake Britain did. It promised more dollars than it could ever redeem. Vietnam, Cold War expansion, social spending. By the late 1960s, foreign governments held more dollars than America had gold. And then, 1971, Nixon closed the gold window. No warning, no vote, no reversal. Just 3 words: temporary suspension. It never reopened. The system survived, but the foundation changed. Again. Now here's the part most people never hear. You've been taught that the United States controls the dollar supply. That stopped being fully true over half a century ago. In the 1950s and 60s, dollars began piling up outside America. In Europe, in offshore banks, beyond U.S. regulation. They were called Eurodollars. Not European money, but U.S. dollars created and lent offshore. No Federal Reserve oversight. No reserve requirements. No transparency. Banks discovered something dangerous. They could create dollar credit without America's permission. And they did. By the 1980s, the offshore dollar system was larger than the U.S. domestic banking system. Let that sink in. Then came 2008. The crisis you remember. But here's the truth. Banks didn't collapse because of mortgages. They collapsed because the global dollar machine froze. And that's when everything changed forever. The Federal Reserve quietly became the lender of last resort, not just for America, but for the world. Through secretive dollar swap lines. Trillions created instantly. No public debate. And here's the question you must sit with. What if that emergency system never shut down? What if crisis became a requirement? Because next, we expose the machine itself. Quick pause here. If this is already changing how you see money, press the like button. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep financial history matters. And if you want more breakdowns like this, clear, honest, and grounded in history, make sure you're subscribed. Now, let's continue. The global dollar system today is not money. It's liquidity theater. Here are the numbers they rarely say out loud. Over 80% of global trade still touches the dollar. More than $13 trillion in dollar-denominated debt exists outside the United States. The offshore dollar market is estimated between $60 and $90 trillion. In 2008, the Federal Reserve committed over $16 trillion in emergency liquidity. Since 2020, global central banks have injected more than $30 trillion. This is not stability. This is life support. The system works like this. Offshore banks create dollar credit. Corporations borrow in dollars. Trade settles in dollars. Crises cause dollar shortages. The Fed prints to save the system. This creates global moral hazard. Risk is rewarded. Losses are socialized. Failure is postponed. This is parasitic finance. And now, the world is quietly adjusting. China settles oil outside the dollar. Trade blocs experiment with bypass systems. Central banks accumulate gold, not because the dollar is dead, but because trust is fragmenting. We are entering a multi-currency world, not one replacement. Many. When the pound fell, the dollar replaced it. This time, the system fractures. Here's the danger. This system is faster than any before it, more leveraged, more global. There will be no slow unwind. When trust breaks, it breaks everywhere at once. Britain had decades to decline. America won't. The final phase is always denial. Denial that debt matters. Denial that printing has consequences. Denial that history still applies. But history is undefeated. The question isn't whether the dollar loses dominance. It already is. But how it loses dominance, and who pays the price when it does. Because currency decline is not an event. It is a transfer. When a reserve currency weakens, it doesn't disappear overnight. It reshapes society quietly, unevenly, and often cruelly. At first, elites adapt. Corporations hedge. Banks reposition. Governments inflate obligations away. But households? They feel it last and hardest. Wages lag behind prices. Savings lose purchasing power year after year. Assets inflate beyond reach. Debt becomes a permanent condition. This is how reserve currencies die in real life. Not with headlines, but with lifestyle erosion. Look closely at the signs around you. Housing no longer reflects shelter. It reflects capital flight. Stock markets no longer price productivity. They price liquidity injections. Education, healthcare, energy, everything essential becomes more expensive, while everything speculative becomes more valuable. That is not coincidence. That is monetary physics. When money is abundant but trust is scarce, capital rushes into anything that cannot be printed. This is why gold is rising quietly. Why commodities reprice suddenly. Why nations repatriate reserves. Why payment systems are being rebuilt in parallel. Not because the dollar is collapsing tomorrow, but because no one wants to be last. Here's an uncomfortable truth. Reserve currency privilege allows a nation to export inflation and import real goods. For decades, the United States consumed more than it produced because the world absorbed the difference in dollars. But privilege has a shelf life. Once confidence erodes, the cost of maintaining dominance skyrockets. More military spending, more financial intervention, more sanctions, more emergency facilities. Power becomes expensive, and eventually, unsustainable. This is where history becomes unforgiving. Rome debased its coinage to fund legions. Spain flooded Europe with silver and collapsed under inflation. Britain overextended empire and debt simultaneously. Every time, the pattern repeats. The reserve issuer believes scale will save them. It never does. Scale accelerates collapse. Because the larger the system, the more leverage required to maintain it, and the more catastrophic the failure when confidence breaks. And confidence always breaks first. Not because of numbers, but because of psychology. At some point, lenders stop asking, can they pay? And start asking, will they? That shift is subtle, invisible in headlines, but irreversible. When that moment arrives, interest rates stop behaving. Currencies stop correlating. Markets stop responding to policy. Control evaporates. This is why central banks now speak differently. Watch their language. They no longer promise stability. They promise tools. They no longer guarantee outcomes. They guarantee intervention. That's not strength. That's contingency planning. And it tells us something critical. They know the old framework is finished. What replaces it won't be announced. It will emerge through necessity. Regional trade agreements. bilateral settlements, commodity-backed arrangements, digital clearing systems, strategic reserves. Not one new system, many overlapping ones. Messy, fragmented, volatile, and far less forgiving. This is what a multipolar monetary world looks like. No single anchor, no universal liquidity backstop, no unquestioned trust. In that world, financial shocks don't spread gradually. They jump instantly across borders. Liquidity disappears faster. Recoveries take longer. Mistakes cost more. And individuals are expected to absorb risk that institutions once carried. That is the future quietly being prepared. So when you hear officials say, the system is resilient, understand what they mean. Resilient for institutions, flexible for governments, adaptive for capital, not for you. History doesn't repeat because leaders are evil. It repeats because incentives don't change. Debt is always easier than discipline. Printing is always easier than reform. Delay is always easier than truth. Until delay becomes collapse. And collapse never announces itself in advance. It arrives disguised as stability, right before confidence snaps. So the real question isn't when the dollar loses dominance. The real question is, will you recognize the shift before the costs are passed down to you? Because by the time it's obvious, positioning is over. Options are limited, and history has already moved on. Measured, calm, unforgiving. This isn't fear. It's precedent. And precedent is history's way of warning you quietly before it teaches loudly. So let me ask you, are we wiser now, or walking the same path in better suits, with faster computers and bigger illusions? If this made you think, share it and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, do you trust the system, or are you finally questioning it? Because history is watching, and it never forgives denial.